This is TWiT.
Can you give us kind of and you know, we talked a little bit about this before the show. Rene is one of those incredible Canadians, and with the Canadian part of it comes the fact that sometimes Apple will release stuff in some countries that isn't available in others. But I was hoping that you could give us a little bit of an overview kind of what this announcement is bringing forth. Kind of what are the headline features or new things that we can look for with this Apple News update?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll preface it just briefly by saying that when you look at Music Plus or you look at TV Plus, these are services that Apple rolled out to 100, now maybe 150 countries with the snap of a finger, where News Plus has been in like 4 or 5 countries going on 4 or 5 years now. And that should tell you everything you need to know about how much more difficult the licensing is for this kind of content than it is for music or television. And I think that's part of what makes this so interesting. They are partnering because with News Plus, it's often the language they use is partnering, I think, because established news media feels sort of under siege by the tyranny of the Google and Facebook algorithms, you know, just stripping all their content away from them. So Apple's partnering with them to produce audio shows, essentially analogous to podcasts. In fact, one of them is a podcast where the Apple News host will do an overview of their carefully curated news content for the day, what they consider to be the most interesting and important stories. But they're also teaming with those publications, you know, things like Vanity Fair, to produce audio versions of some of the biggest feature stories of the week. I think they said they're going to do 20 of those a week now, and they're professionally narrated, almost like you're someone with like a Micah Sargent or Leo Laporte style big time radio voice going through and very carefully enunciating all the syllables to make it sound like a really awesome presentation. And that part of it, the part with just the 20 feature stories, is US only. But other elements of it, the podcast specifically, seems to be available in other places and even different podcast apps if you want to search for it.
Yeah, so let's talk about the podcast first before we get into the audio that's within the app. And the reason why is because of what you've just said. You know, there was some concern when this feature was still in the rumored stage. You know, it's weird how rumors often lead to fear, uncertainty, and doubt, huh? Anyway, let's talk about how. You know, at once it was maybe thought that this was going to be a sort of walled off approach, that this podcast would exist in a place where others couldn't get access to it. And it was Apple's first foray into sort of going the route of Spotify. Yes, exactly. Exactly. So what is this podcast exactly? And then it is then an RSS feed that people can go and subscribe to in whatever podcast app.
Yeah, and I get the feeling because there's some people who have a very deep emotional connection with podcasts, going back to the days of RSS and the free internet. And, you know, we're all a little bit of that beatnik hippie inside of us if we've grown up, you know, in the post-Dave Wiener era of the internet. And Spotify has given people some concern that podcasts will be closed down and made to be featured content the way some Netflix content is or Apple TV Plus content is. But Apple seems to be doing this just like a podcast. And I think there's also some disagreement about whether podcasts are special, precious things or they're just another form of audio content, like an audiobook or like music. So we're not quite sure how we feel about all this stuff yet, but we are very reassured that this is still a podcast. We don't have to think about it too much yet.
That's good. Yeah.
Bigger questions, at least.
A podcast that is it a daily podcast? Because that was the part that I didn't quite pick up on.
It's a weekly podcast, I believe. I believe it's a weekly podcast.
Yeah, so we'll hear sort of a summary of the week's most important news, or at least news stories that the Apple News curators want to cover.
And they want to put a huge emphasis on the journalism. You hear that word over and over again when they talk about it. And I think that goes back to Steve Jobs, where for a brief moment in time, he thought the iPad could rescue journalism. But they want to not just go over the news, because I think there's a lot, especially in the modern era, where we don't respect our sources, we don't reference them, you know, and where the information comes from gets very quickly forgotten. And they want to not just promote the stories, but the journalism and the outlets that went into those stories.
Gotcha. Yeah. So then let's talk about Apple News Plus audio stories. Yes, that is a long word or a long phrase, but this is interesting to me because shortly before this had all been announced, the New York Times was sort of taking a step back from Apple News Plus and was sort of going its own way. And with that, I saw a tweet, I think it was from Farhad Manjoo, who had posted an article on the New York Times, or posted, a piece on the New York Times, and had narrated it as well, had included an audio version. Now, that is one way of doing things. This way, it's my understanding that Apple has, like you said, hired professional voice actors to do this. Yeah. So I'm just curious about your take on this. Do you, as a person who for a long time, wrote stories and continues to write articles and things like that, do you feel there's a disconnect when you have a voice actor or voice performer reading the stories that someone else has written, or do you feel like this could work?
So, and that's a good point. I originally got my idea from Joanna Stern because she would make an article and a video in the Wall Street Journal, and you could choose which one you wanted. They weren't perfect duplicates, but they were, you could choose where the content was. And when I started my YouTube channel, I very specifically wanted to have the video and the audio and the text available so that you could choose the medium. To me, it was an accessibility thing. I didn't even think about it in terms of performance or art or medium. It was just, I want to make everything accessible to everybody. And when I first heard Apple announce this, I wondered if there was an accessibility angle where they didn't just want to give you a screen reader, but they wanted to give you like a performance of some of the best pieces. And I still wonder if that's part of the inspiration. But I think at the end, it's going to have to be an incredibly tight line that they walk, because when the author reads it, it's just the author reading their own words. But if someone is narrating it, there's a very quick line between awesome and cringe that you don't want to pass over. That's true.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess I hadn't considered the way that this is almost reminiscent of not just captions on a movie or something like that, but actual audio descriptions. Yeah. Where I've turned those on before simply to have the experience and understand how that works. And yeah, it's a whole nother kind of experience. And I think what I find interesting, and this line that I think is going to have to be towed here, is what kinds of pieces end up getting. It looks like Apple says it's going to be about 20 audio stories a week across a wide range of interests. And I think about the editorialization that can take place in the delivery of written word when it's spoken. And that is one of the concerns that I have, because the way you say and can change the utter meaning of a piece. And so that's going to be fascinating. And I don't know, do we have any more knowledge, past this newsroom announcement about if the voice actors are going to be working closely with the authors of the piece? Like, is there anything we know about the process by which Apple selects these stories and then does produce them?
I don't think we know the exact process for this. I think just extrapolating from what we know of Apple, it will be something that they practiced 100 times, 1,000 times internally. And hopefully, like very early on, they caught the things like, and so the cabbage was removed from the shelves until the blight infestation, like sort of like when Andy Nacco gets into his opera voice. That part they probably pushed down on very quickly. But I'm guessing there'll also be some trial and error, and they'll get feedback in the first week about whether they're hitting the target or not.
Definitely. I'm definitely looking forward to checking that part out. And then the last thing was curated local news. Yeah. So I think this is really interesting. There are different apps and different news services that provide curated local news in different ways. But this is to give people the ability to see what's going on in their, locale. What are the areas that are being covered right now? Is it a lot of them, or is it very few? What are we looking at there with curated local news?
So it's I want to say it's a little bit of both, but it's not really. It's like a Bay Area, which is like the San Francisco Bay Area, Houston, Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco. But they're also adding more local newspapers. Like they're going to add Le Devoir, which is a very well-known French language newspaper in Quebec. So It depends on the size of your locality. In the U.S., there's a lot of you guys have so many big cities, Micah, that the rest of us don't really have to deal with. But that's really important because a lot of papers have run out of funding, and they often just run news that comes in off the wire, and it's hard to invest in local reporting, and the resources aren't there. And I don't know if this will give them a boost or not, but I think it's important when you go to your phone that you don't just get the big stories from around the country because you forget what's happening at home.